Hi, it's time to break down the different categories within fair housing.
Civil Rights Act of 1968, Fair Housing Act. Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 is referred to as the Fair Housing Act. It expanded the 1964 legislation to prohibit discrimination in the sale, leasing, advertising sales or rental, financing, or brokerage services providing protection from discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, handicap, and familial status. Sex and gender was added as a protection under the law, with the 1974 amendment later added. People with disabilities and families with children was added as protected classes under the law with the 1988 amendment. There are two categories of housing covered by the 1968 Fair Housing Act: single family and multifamily. Single family housing. When a single family home is government owned, all fair housing laws must be followed. When a single family home is privately owned and a real estate licensee is hired to sell or rent the home, all fair housing laws must be followed. When a single-family home is owned by a person who owns 4 or more residential properties, all fair housing laws must be followed. When a single-family home is owned by someone who has sold 2 or more houses in the past 2 years that were not owner-occupied, all fair housing laws must be followed. If it is a single-family house and government-owned housing or privately owned if a real estate agent is employed to sell or rent it, or property owned by a person who owns 4 or more residential properties total, or if someone has sold 2 or more houses, not owner occupied, in the past 2 years, then requires compliance with the Act without exception. Applying fair housing. Memorizing who has to comply and who does not have to comply can start to bog down the brain. But if you understand the reasoning behind the law, then it gets easier to memorize. The application of fair housing is broken down into 2 different types of housing. There is single-family housing and multi-unit family housing. It makes sense that if a property is government-owned, then the government is always going to follow fair housing laws. If the property is privately owned and a real estate agent is hired to assist with the sale, then fair housing laws will always be followed. That means that someone cannot contact you as a real estate agent and tell you that they want to rent their home to a man with no women allowed and have you assist in the rental. If the property owner owns 4 or more properties, then they are considered an investor and will always have to follow fair housing laws. The same is true for someone who has sold 2 or more homes within the past 2 years if they didn't live in the homes. They are deemed an investor and must follow fair housing. Multifamily housing. When a multifamily building has 5 or more units, all fair housing laws must always be followed. When a multifamily building has 4 or fewer units and the owner does not live in one of the units, all fair housing laws must be followed. If it is a multifamily unit housing and has 5 or more units or has 4 or fewer units when the owner doesn't live in one of the units, then it requires compliance with the Act without exception. Multifamily. A multifamily unit building is viewed as being owned as an investment. However, the Fair Housing Law recognizes that an owner may also be living in one of the units. If there are 5 units or more, the government weighs towards the investment and fair housing always has to be met. But if there are 4 units or less and the owner lives in one of the units, then fair housing does not have to be met. Fair housing exemptions. If the seller owns 3 or fewer single-family dwellings, the owner is exempt under fair housing law. If the seller has only sold one non-owner occupied home within 24 months, the owner is exempt under fair housing law. If the owner lives in one of the units of a multifamily building that has 4 or fewer units, the owner is exempt under fair housing law. If the property is in a 55 and up housing community, which has been officially registered as such, the owner is exempt under fair housing for familial status. Exemptions only qualify if there are no discriminatory advertising involved and a real estate agent is not used to help sell or rent the property. Remember, the 1866 law overrides the exemptions in regards to race. Who does not have to comply with Fair Housing Act? If the seller owns 3 or fewer single-family dwellings, or if the seller was not living in the house and was not the most recent resident when the property was sold or rented, still allowed one exempt sale within a 24-month period, or for rentals in multifamily dwellings with 4 or fewer family units when the owner lives in one of the units, or in a 55 and up housing communities officially registered as such, age exemption only. Then, exempt from Fair Housing Act if also a real estate agent was not involved in the sale or lease and there was no discriminatory advertising involved. Why are exemptions allowed? So you might be wondering why the law had to be complicated by allowing for exemptions. Let me give you an example where I think you would agree that the homeowner being picky about who can live on the property might actually be reasonable. Lydia is a hard-working nurse who works nights in the trauma unit at the local hospital. She bought a duplex and moved into one side of the rental unit. She noticed that the walls between the units are a bit thin and allows for loud voices and laughter to filter through. She loves kids, but is fearful that if kids live in the other side of the duplex, she won't get enough sleep to allow her to be alert at work. This could cause her to put other lives at risk. So Lydia decides not to allow children to live in the other unit.